Jug life. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, okay, so welcome to tonight's Fiveable Cram session, which is coming right ahead of the AP US History exam, okay? So yes, make sure you stay hydrated, kids, and we're here now. Don't pull an all-nighter, okay? Don't pull an all-nighter. That's not going to be a thing that I would encourage you to do at all. Oh, do y'all want to talk about the Treaty of Whoa? Okay, so as far as that, yeah, I tell you, y'all enjoy that, don't you? All right, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, remember how this works. I'm going to be giving some priority to the questions that are getting upvotes. Now, remember, upvotes, let them be organic. Don't ask people to upvote your question, okay? So as far as that goes, I mean, go to bed at some point tonight, preferably at a decent hour. Did somebody just say they wanted a dab before we get started? So let's go ahead and do that, okay? Whew. All right. So with that, could I please give some tips on how to do well on the DBQ? Okay. So with that, EY, I've got a 3-part video on the DBQ where I go into depth. But the main thing here is let me give you a few tips as you're going in. First of all, a lot of students are resistant to pre-writing. Okay. They are resistant to pre-writing for whatever reason. I don't understand. It's like I always tell students, like, pre-write. Okay. Actually, like, write some. Okay, sorry, I think that, but pre-write, okay? That when it comes down to it, when you're annotating the documents, write some things down. Like when you've got your like rhetorical analysis, point of view, complex audience and purpose, like note those things. You know, when do you see that person catering to an audience or something like that? So you want to go ahead and note those things as you're going through here, okay? So make sure make sure that you are making notes. You go through the documents. The second part is a T-chart, okay, that divide the documents into 2 or 3 groups. Now, if you're going for a more complex essay, I would say 3. I think that when you get 4 or more documents in the same group, that you're kind of, watering it down a little bit, okay, that it's tough to make an argument, but 2 or 3 documents together can be used to make an argument, okay? And so when you're thinking about this, like if you're going to get that 6, the point for using 6 documents argumentatively, you've got to have the documents sorted in some way that I'm making a point. If your essay is thesis driven, now if you do a T-chart and you've got 3 separate arguments, then you can write your thesis statement based on those arguments in the T-chart, and it gives you a line of reasoning. Yes, hydration is very, very, very essential. Okay. So with that, you want to make sure that you're doing that. And then, that you are making sure, sometimes I tell people, write your thesis before you start writing. Make sure that you have a thesis statement, write that down, compare it to the prompt, and make sure that the thesis is responsive to the prompt. It's historically defensible, and it includes a line of reasoning. Okay, so make sure that is the case. Hydration nation. Okay, so some tips on how to do well in the DBQ. Those would be a few things here. Now, can I talk about immigration? Sure. Okay, so what do we want to note here? Can I please hit the whoa? All right. So with that, I'm talking about immigration. So let's go ahead and start with, the earliest immigrants to the United States tended to come from Northern and Western Europe, from present day Germany, Scandinavia, and the British Isles. Like people like me whose ancestors are English and Scottish. A lot of these immigrants got there first. Okay. Now, if you want to be welcome, if you think about it as a general rule, if you want to be welcomed in the United States, all right, now remember, ladies and gentlemen, the chat is for chat. Questions and answers are for questions. So if you have questions, make sure you ask a question, and then people will upvote it if they have the same question. We've got over 100 people in here, so we're going to have to go with the questions that are getting the most upvotes, okay? And so with that, if you want to be welcome in the United States and you're an immigrant group, the best way to do that is to make sure you are white, Protestant, and English speaking. Okay, that when you've got that combination, you are not very likely to arouse a nativist, a nativist onslaught. Now, the first group of immigrants to be resented in U.S. history were the Irish. Okay, so for two reasons. First of all, the Irish were Catholic. Okay, so the Irish were Catholic. Now, before the Irish got here, what we want to note about today is that before the antebellum period, there were very, very few Catholics in the United States. Like only maybe about 5% of Americans were Catholic. And so the Irish were the first Catholic group to immigrate into the United States. And today, Catholics make up about a quarter of the country. Now, Protestants make up, more than Catholics as far as numbers, but Catholics are the largest single religious group in the United States. And so the Irish came in, they were Catholic, and they were also working for cheap. And so there were people who were hiring there were people who resented this, and there were even signs that said, no Irish need apply. Like, we don't want to hire Irish people. They were discriminated against for employment. In one case, I believe in Philadelphia, it was that, they burned a Catholic church, like the mob got together and burned a Catholic church. So there was a nativist sentiment there. Now, remember that this nativist sentiment comes to a head with the American Party, or popularly known as the Know Nothing Party, that competed in the 1856 election. That the Know Nothing Party was one of the parties that tried to be a successor party for the Whigs. Okay, so that's something that you want to keep in mind when you're looking at that the Know Nothing Party was an anti-immigrant party in response to Irish, and also there was some German immigration as well in the antebellum period. And of course, to some of these temperance reformers, know that Irish and German people come from cultures where drinking alcohol is more acceptable. Then you've got the temperance movement in the United States, and so these immigrants tended to be loyal to the Democratic Party. Okay, so they tended to vote for the Democratic Party, and so the Whigs did not tend to like them. The Whigs tended to have more Protestants. And so with that, then we go to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. Okay, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. Now, Chinese immigration, was starting in the, around the time, 1850s, 60s, and a lot of Chinese workers worked on building the transcontinental railroads. Now, once the transcontinental railroads were built and that cheap labor was no longer needed, then a lot of resentment was building up in the West Coast, and then Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act represented the first time that Congress passed any kind of immigration restriction. And so immigrants could not come from China. I think there were some exceptions if they fit in certain categories, but by and large, for the purposes of APUSH, they just couldn't come in. Now, for Japan, was developing a relationship with the United States, was westernizing. At the turn of the 20th century, Japan, in order to avoid having their immigration restricted, Japan agreed to what was called the Gentleman's Agreement. Okay, so this was, instead of the United States Congress legislating against Japanese immigration, then the Japanese the Japanese government said, well, we just will control it on our end because we don't want the embarrassment of immigration restrictions against Japanese people. So with that, going from there, we get at the turn of the 20th century, the new immigrants starting in about the 1890s. Okay, so with the new immigrants, what's so new about them? Now, these are people, remember, traditional immigration came from Northern and Western Europe, Scandinavia, North Germany, and the British Isles. And so immigration at the turn of the 20th century starts coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, so Southern and Eastern Europe. And so these are places like Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, the Balkans. Okay, so Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, the Balkans is what we're looking at. There. Okay, so from there, now, of course, in the 1920s, we saw immigration acts that were passed. Basically, the first Immigration Quota Act, happens there. Okay, so Okay, yeah, I have no idea what's going on there in the chat. I probably shouldn't be paying too much attention to the chat. But the Immigration Quota Acts of the 1920s, they were designed to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, of course, the context for this was the first Red Scare. People were thinking in terms of of radical immigrants, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution. With that. Okay, so going from there, then I think that's the main thing. As far as that goes, I don't know if you necessarily, need to, you need to know really anything more than that. Okay, so those would be the main things about immigration. How do you get the contextualization point? Okay, so the contextualization point, you've got to be thinking in terms of what is something in the immediate background. Now, when we're thinking about outside information, it's just like, okay, outside information is like this, that, this is outside information. For example, if we're writing about the American Revolution, okay, the lead in, let's say that we're writing about the tensions between Great Britain and the American colonies between 1763 and 1776. Now, contextualization, that would be in the immediate background or kind of like something that's a cause. Like maybe kind of the Star Wars opening crawl kind of thing. So if I were writing an essay that was about the tensions between Britain and the colonies, then what I'm thinking in terms of is what caused this in the first place. So I might start writing about the French and Indian War or salutary neglect and looking at what was it like beforehand. Now, if I'm looking for outside evidence, then I've got things like the Stamp Act or the Intolerable Acts. These are things that are right there in the timeline, what's going on there. But when we think about salutary neglect, okay, when we think about salutary neglect, then we're thinking about in terms of contextualization, because it's kind of a lurker. Like what I think about is outside evidence is like standing right here next to me, like in the gathering. And then context is like, what's that lurker doing over there? And knowing what that lurker's doing over there is somewhat helpful. You see, it's somewhat helpful and gives me a better read for the room, but isn't quite the same necessarily as isn't quite necessarily the same as something that is right here next to me. Okay, so that's something that I think is important to understand as well. Now, an overview of Reaganomics. Okay, so when we think about Reaganomics, this is of course a philosophy of low taxes. Okay, something that is about low taxes and getting into where low taxes and low regulation. Okay, so that's something that is important in terms of that. Low taxes, low regulation. Now, Reaganomics, also the tax cuts, okay, the idea that tax cuts are going to generate wealth, okay, so that basically the lowering of taxes, especially on the upper brackets. Now, opponents called Reaganomics trickle-down economics, okay, trickle-down economics, because trickle, when you think of trickle, it's like almost a glorified drip. So trickle down economics. Okay, so that's Reaganomics. Now, another thing we want to note is that Reagan wanted to cut taxes. He also wanted to cut government spending, but he wanted to do it while raising military spending. So Reagan was never able to get the cuts that he wanted in domestic spending, like with social welfare programs and such. But Reagan, was able to get the increase in defense spending. So when you take into account that Reagan was able to get the tax cuts, the increases in defense spending, but not the cuts in domestic spending and social welfare spending, you see massive deficits during the Reagan presidency. And so that's how that works. And so with that, Republican presidents ever since Reagan, they've had some success cutting taxes, but they haven't had as much success reining in spending or the deficits. Certainly, Grace, I'd be glad to talk about time strategies for the writing section. So time strategies for the writing section. The College Board recommends, that you spend it's an hour and 40 minutes total, 100 minutes total, an hour and 40 minutes. The College Board recommends 60 minutes for the DBQ and 40 minutes for the LEQ. Now, the thing is that unless you're writing an LEQ that's going to get you like a 5 or a 6, you don't really need, I mean, y'all let me know in the chat if y'all think that I'm talking sense here, but unless you're writing an LEQ that's going to get a 5 or a 6, you probably don't need more than like 20 minutes to write the LEQ. And so even with a 5 or 6 LEQ, it can be it can be something that is in terms of even a five or six can be written in 30 minutes. And so with that, I think in terms of while the College Board recommends 60-40, I recommend 70-30. Okay. I recommend 70-30 because I think that realistically, and y'all can tell me in the chat if you're thinking about that. Now, Dahlia, if you're wanting a short review of each period, there should be an archived broadcast somewhere with Fiveable. If we go to, let me see what I've got here. Okay, so let me see here. Going into that. Let's see. Advice from an APUSH reader, the American Rev. Let's see. I don't see this one, but there was like a 2-hour thing or something like that. I don't know if that's still up with Fiveable. All right. So, but time strategy for the writing section. I think in terms of the 70-30, like an hour 10 for the DBQ and 30 minutes for the LEQ, because I think it's important. Now, unless you know that you can write a DBQ in 60 minutes, in 60 minutes, no matter what, but in a lot of cases, it takes a little time. Yeah, so I would say 70 minutes for the DBQ, 30 minutes for the LEQ, an hour 10 for the DBQ. And if you finish the LEQ, if you finish the DBQ, then fine. If you finish the DBQ in an hour, you've got more time. Look at it as a bonus, you see, because I think that an unfinished DBQ, you could end up losing more points from that than from an unfinished LEQ. And we also want to note, not only is the DBQ more complicated, but it counts as more of your exam. The DBQ counts for 25% of your exam. This one essay that you write counts for 25% of your exam. So that's why I say that you should budget an hour and 10 for the DBQ and 30 for the LEQ. And I think that if you're on top of your LEQ, that essay should be able to be written in 30 minutes, especially if you do good pre-writing, because you want to think in terms of when you're thinking about pre-writing, it separates the thinking from the writing process. And so you spend less time just staring at your paper. I think why it takes some people so long to do this stuff is because they're staring at the paper so long, and they're spending so much time staring at the paper that they are not, they're not actually writing the whole time. So I think that when you do a bit of pre-writing, whether it's outlining or my pre-writing boxes or something like that, then that's what you're seeing here. Now, speaking of pre-writing, let me go ahead and just kind of let me pull up something here, and let's see. So, okay, and somebody actually asked about Reconstruction, so I think that I can do something here. Okay, so with that, let's see. Okay, looking for something in particular here. Give me just a second. If I don't find it, I'm just going to go on. But okay, yes. Okay, so somebody's asked about Reconstruction, and let me kind of put in this with a, with kind of some LEQ tips or anything, that sort of thing. Okay, so with that, let me go ahead and share my screen here, and we will take a look at Reconstruction. Okay, so as far as that goes, presidential versus radical Reconstruction. For example, we had an LEQ that said evaluate the extent to which presidential Reconstruction differed from radical Reconstruction. Now it's going for comparison, but of course you can use any of the thinking skills in any LEQ essay and get credit for the historical reasoning point. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and take a look. This is the pre-writing setup that I recommend here. And so presidential, what I do here is I've got my boxes. Presidential Reconstruction. Here, I've got things that are unique to presidential Reconstruction. Here, I've got things that are unique to radical Reconstruction. So essentially, like you see where presidential Reconstruction, Lincoln wanted to be generous to the former Confederate States of America. He had his 10% plan. So when we see here on the other side, the radicals wanted to treat the Confederacy as the Confederate States as conquered provinces. Then you've got where Lincoln had his 10% plan, which made it easy for the Southern states to get back into the Union by just emancipating slaves and 10% of people swearing an oath to the United States. And then, that's it. The Wade-Davis bill had harsher terms for Reconstruction. Now, remember that Lincoln pocket vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. And so that's something, as long as Lincoln was alive, the president remained in control of Reconstruction. Now, also, when we look at the Constitution in Reconstruction, we see that the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment was part of presidential Reconstruction. And the 13th Amendment, of course, abolished slavery. I always ask students, what else did the 13th Amendment do besides abolish slavery? And the answer is nothing. It did absolutely nothing. It abolished slavery, and then it did absolutely nothing. And so Lincoln was basically like, look, we need to preserve the Union, and we need to abolish slavery. And so then there are no civil rights acts, okay? So Lincoln's not saying that there need to be any federal civil rights acts. He's really concerned about getting back to business, preserving the Union, and making sure that slaves are emancipated. But he's not really looking to push anything else on the South. Lincoln, remember that Lincoln's got some kind of conservative tendencies when you think about him this way. And then radical Reconstruction, we're looking at conquered provinces, the Wade-Davis bill, the 14th and 15th Amendment. So the radicals wanted to give African Americans full citizenship and voting rights. And so with that, we see that that's going a step further than Lincoln, because Lincoln was only concerned with emancipation. Okay. So with that, we see citizenship for African Americans. Now, from there, we want to note that, both presidential and radical Reconstruction. Now, people are asking about how many paragraphs. Now, if I want to just write a basic essay, okay, when we look at the rubric, we have to make a comparison. But if we're going for complex understanding, that kind of unicorn point, as some teachers call it, that point, if we're going for complex understanding, we want to be thinking in terms of we need to have 3 body paragraphs, okay? So if we're not going for complex understanding and we just want to make a comparison, write like a 3, 4 out of 6 essay, which if you write a 3 out of 6 essay, you're writing an above average essay. I think typically the average essay score is about like a 2 point something out of 6. And so if you write 3, then you're good. If you write 4, you're well above average. And so, with this, we can just compare them and we can have 2 body paragraphs. But what I would do here is if you're trying to do similarities and as well as differences, then you need another paragraph. So both presidential Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction brought the South back into the Union. They were plans to bring the South back into the Union. They increased the rights of African Americans. I mean, when you think about it, that emancipation, that is an increase in rights. And then they were both involved in amending the Constitution to increase federal power. Because remember, with the 13th Amendment, the original Constitution left slavery to the states. And so with that, that's a quick overview of presidential and radical Reconstruction. And also you can see my pre-writing format, okay? Now, as far as that goes, I would, after my body paragraphs, I would only restate the thesis. Exactly, Mackenzie. I would only restate the thesis, the CSA, the Confederate States of America. All right, so with that, all right, posting a study guide link every so often. That's nice of you. All right, so what are, I like that, Paul, all of them, okay? So I would say, if I were just going off the top of my head, I would say the First Amendment, then the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, first through fourth, probably so, because Third Amendment, quartering soldiers in homes, if you're talking about the American Revolution. Okay. So as far as that goes, the Bill of Rights, now I wouldn't get too deep into like the, into the weeds there, but the 10th Amendment, okay, I would say the 10th Amendment is important because that is what, protects the rights of the states. And so if you're thinking about the Anti-Federalists, the 10th Amendment was one of the things that the Anti-Federalists demanded in response, like if they were going to be in a situation where they were going to approve the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution. And so with that, we want to make sure that, that we know that those amendments are important. Now, then I would say 13th, 14th, 15th, because those are the Reconstruction amendments. 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, because those are the progressive amendments. And then after that, I wouldn't necessarily go into amendment numbers, so much as just understanding that like during the civil rights era, the poll tax was, was constitutionally eliminated in the Constitution. Also during Vietnam, the Constitution was amended to lower the voting age for 18, to 18. All right. Yes. And so that, y'all got the Wade Davis bill there. Okay, very good. Notice how I put the 10% plan and the Wade Davis bill in my pre-writing, that when I'm comparing, I'm actually doing kind of, when I can, kind of a tit for tat kind of thing there. All right. So going from there, I need help with Jacksonian democracy. Okay. Jacksonian democracy, Annie, is something that I end up talking about nearly every time I end up broadcasting. And so with that, what we want to remember about Jacksonian democracy is that before the age of Jackson, okay, before the 1820s, there was typically, it was typically focused on, you had like the framers. Okay. For example, what we want to remember, first of all, is that the framers of the Constitution were not trying to create a democracy. Okay. They were not trying to create a democracy. They were trying to create something that kind of combined aristocracy with democracy. Okay. So combine aristocracy and democracy kind of together. So if you think about like the Senate, for example, the Senate, the senators were not directly elected. The senators were instead, they were appointed by the state legislatures. Okay, so they were appointed by the state legislatures, the U.S. Senate. And so then the House, those people were directly elected by the voters. Now, then we have to think about who were the voters. Okay, so the voters at that time, in the founding generation, these were people who owned a certain amount of property, that there was not in the founding period universal white male suffrage. Okay, that had not happened yet. There had to be a certain, requirement of property ownership at that time. So that's something that I think is important to note, there. So that we didn't have a democracy. The Constitution didn't create that. Now, as the United States expanded west, okay, what you started to see was that as they expanded west, like Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, who are the people going to those states? They tended to be people without a lot of property, people looking for opportunity. So the constitutions of those western states tended not to have property requirements. They tended not to have property requirements, for those states, and that anybody could vote, any white man could vote. And so that ends up going east as well. So in the 1820s and 1830s, what we start to see is a large rise in political participation. And in the founding generation, presidential electors would have typically been, appointed by the state legislature. But what we start to see is like what we have today, where we don't have a presidential election. We have 51 distinct presidential elections where the people in each state determine who they want to be president, and each state sends electors to vote for that person. But the Electoral College was initially supposed to be kind of a closed group and kind of keep the president away from the people. All right. So with that, a bit about Jacksonian democracy. All right. So we've done quite a bit with the Gilded Age. Of course, I don't know if I've talked about it in this particular broadcast, but as far as that, let's see. So Richard had a good idea. Where is Richard? Okay, so I'm just kind of curious about what that good idea is. But Richard, congratulations on a good idea. Carla thinks you're smart, and Carla's been a very good participant in this chat. So as far as the Gilded Age, let's go ahead and take a quick look here. Let me go and let's see, Fiveable, APUSH, and I want to go in here and open up my progressive era slides. I do, anytime somebody asks about the Gilded Age, here's the main thing that I end up getting into, okay, is really looking at the Gilded Age as a whole, okay? So when you start to see it and also comparing it to the progressive era. So during the Gilded Age, the Gilded Age was characterized by government support for big business, when we have, now this is kind of my thesis here, kind of my mini thesis about the Gilded Age. Now, one misunderstanding a lot of people have is that the government was laissez-faire during the Gilded Age, but the government wasn't laissez-faire. If you think about the Pacific Railway Acts, or Railroad Acts, whatever you call it, that the Pacific Railroad Acts were not laissez-faire. They gave these corporations subsidies. And so the government was directly supporting these companies. And then you had the Great Railroad Strike and the Pullman Strike. Both of those strikes were broken up by the federal government. Okay, the federal government intervened in both cases, and broke up those strikes. Okay, and so with that, now also we might want to note the let's see, I'm having a bit of a Rick Perry moment there. Maybe that'll come to me in a second. Okay. Oh, also the high tariff. Okay, so we want to note that the tariff was very high, a very high protective tariff during the Gilded Age. That is also not laissez-faire, because remember, laissez-faire is based on revenue tariffs. And so the progressive era, government regulation of big business. Okay, so you've got the Meat Inspection Act, the FDA. These are two things that were passed to regulate business. And also Teddy Roosevelt mediated the anthracite coal strike in 1902. So Teddy Roosevelt mediated this strike. He invited the business leaders and the labor leaders to call and to come in together. Okay, so to come in together and to get that going. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and note that, yeah, so Teddy Roosevelt's not just taking the side of big business. Now, this is part of Teddy Roosevelt's square deal. Okay, part of Teddy Roosevelt's square deal. All right, and then the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, now when we think about the Gilded Age, we think about the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed during the Gilded Age in 1890, but it was very weak, and it was actually used against labor unions more than it was used against big business. Okay, so it was used by labor unions more than it was used against big business. And so then you see the Clayton Antitrust Act passed during the progressive era, and that was stronger antitrust legislation that specifically exempted labor unions. So we see here that there is a different attitude toward labor unions than what we saw in the Gilded Age. Now, partly responsible for that, we want to note Samuel Gompers and the AFL, okay, the American Federation of Labor. So Samuel Gompers and the American Federation of Labor, that's something that we want to keep that in mind and kind of focus on what Gompers is doing. That Gompers is what Gompers is saying here is that he is a proud American. That labor unions, this is what's called bread and butter unionism. Now, bread and butter unionism says that we're not trying to overturn the capitalist mode of production. That labor unions were often in the Gilded Age, they were lumped in with socialist, communist, anarchist, immigrants, people like that. But Samuel Gompers is like, look, I'm a native born American. I love this country. I don't mind the capitalist mode of production. I'm just into bread and butter unionism. Bread and butter unionism, when we talk about bread and butter unionism, wait, I haven't been sharing my screen at this. Have I been, was I sharing my screen earlier when I showed that Gilded Age stuff? I hope so, but maybe I wasn't. But just in case, I'm going to go ahead and put that on there. Okay, so I wasn't sharing the screen when I thought that I was. Okay, so Eugene V. Debs, he was more of a socialist, kind of a pioneer of the international workers of the world, okay, where these are people who wanted to challenge the capitalist mode of production. Also, during World War I, Samuel Gompers and the AFL, they all agreed that they were not going to strike during wartime because such a thing would be unpatriotic. Now, they did, they did strike after the war. They made up for lost time. There were a great many strikes after World War I, which of course was part of the reason leading to the Republican victory in the 1920s. And we kind of see that the 1920s really sort of went back to a more pro-business climate, pro-business, low taxes, not going back to the Gilded Age where the government was, supporting business on that kind of level, but something that kind of more balanced it out, I think. Okay, so with that, sorry about that, I thought I was screen sharing earlier, and I suppose that I was not. Okay, so with that, how can we discuss how to insert POV, context, audience, and purpose on the DBQ? Okay. All right, so going from there, let me go ahead and take a look at, I've got some sample DBQs on my computer here. So let's go ahead and think about if we want to get those document analysis points. So we go into the DBQ LEQ, and let's say sample DBQ responses. All right, so that is recent there. Okay, so let's go ahead and pull that up. All right, so with this, let's see, do I have that? Let's see, that is a, I don't know if this is the one. These may not be the droids I'm looking for. Okay, so let me just run in there real quick and just take a look here. Let's see, Word document, APUSH. Okay, for instance, okay. So let me go in here. All right. Sorry, just looking for a response here, and I'm just not finding exactly what I'm looking for here. When we're getting questions that require me to pull up something. Let's see. So what do I've got one on. Gosh, I swore I had one. But anyway, as far as that goes, let's see if I can find something in this document here. Okay, so let's see. Outside evidence. Okay, so historical context. Let's see. So that is one of those. Let's see. Okay, so I've got something right here that I think will be helpful here. All right. So as far as that goes, we've got evaluate the extent. Let me actually share my screen on this one. Okay. So evaluate the extent. Evaluate the extent to which the French and Indian War altered the relationship between Britain and its North American colonies in the period 1740 to 1770. All right, so as far as that goes, I'm thinking in terms, my thesis here is the French and Indian War played a significant role in increasing tensions between Britain and its North American colonies because of British policies passed after the war regarding westward expansion, westward movement, and taxes, okay? And so when we go from here, we see here, this is going to be focused on taxes. Okay, so my paragraph here is focused on taxes. And note that when I did my pre-writing, I did, I've got here, this is kind of a simpler one where I'm only using 5 documents. I'm not necessarily using 7 here. I'm going for about a 5 out of 7 on this one. Like this DBQ here is going to be, 5 out of 7. And it's not going to get complex understanding. It's not going to get supported with 6 because only 5 documents were referenced in the essay. But it's going to score all of the other points. And so what you see here is this paragraph is going to be about taxes. And note that on my T-chart, I already noted that I've got 2 documents that I'm going to use here, okay? And so the French and Indian War also angered colonists because of changes in the British government's taxation policies toward them. Before the French and Indian War, Parliament passed the Navigation Acts that taxed imported goods, but they were never enforced. This non-enforcement policy, known as salutary neglect, had allowed colonists to smuggle imported goods without paying taxes or being punished. After the French and Indian War, okay, let's see. After the French and Indian War, let's see where we were there. Yeah, the British abandoned the policy of salutary neglect, as evidenced by a British order in council after the war, in which the king was asked to allow for stronger taxation on the colonies, which were costing the government money. Now, here is my actual document reference, okay? Now, notice here that I'm bringing up the document specifically. I'm naming the document in addition to citing the document. So this sentence is about showing that I understand what the document says, okay, so that I am accurately describing the document. So I want to make sure that I do that. And after I've done that, the British government listened to the order in council because Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which lowered the tax on imported sugar, but strengthened its collection and cracked down on smuggling. Now, in this case, I'm not bringing in the Sugar Act so much as outside evidence as I'm presenting it as context, document context for document 6. Now, the reader, if I didn't have like 3 like POV, context, audience, purpose, like the rhetorical analysis side of that, then a reader could count this as outside evidence. Okay, so this could be counted as outside evidence or document context, however the reader decides would be better for you. Okay, and so as far as that one, I do a similar thing here where I say the Stamp Act was even more controversial than the Sugar Act because it was an internal tax on the colonies passed without consent of colonial legislatures. Colonists protested the Stamp Act by replacing the tax stamp with a skull and crossbones, as seen on a copy of the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. So once again, I'm making a reference here and I'm showing that I understand what's going on in the document. And so what I see here, again, I'm providing historical context. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed due to colonists boycotting British goods, but tension remained high between Britain and the colonies afterwards, which eventually led to the American Revolution. So when you're using, when you're doing this, when you're putting it right after a document, a lot of times that's going to be historical context. In this case, I use historical context every time. That's what you want to remember, that when you're doing context, audience, and audience and purpose, that's what you're looking at there. Now, another one, I can't necessarily find my, all of my files right now on demand, but let me go ahead and pull up Reagan's, let's see. So we've got Reagan's Evil Empire speech. So in March of 1983, Ronald Reagan delivered what is known as his Evil Empire speech. And this was a speech that was basically calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. All right. So calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, but he was delivering this speech to the American Association of Evangelicals. Well, why does that matter? Okay, so as far as that goes, why does that matter that he's talking to the American Association of Evangelicals? Now, the evangelical Christians were part of Reagan's coalition, his conservative coalition. Remember, that started with the Moral Majority when Jerry Falwell. And so as far as that goes, if I'm looking at this particular speech, then okay, so he talks about he's trying to get these people on board with his aggressive foreign policy. Now, he's talking to evangelical Christians who are probably not the first people who are going to get all excited about ramping up military spending and, stepping up to the Soviets, right? Now, he tells a story here. A number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our own way of life were very much on people's minds. And he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly, though, I heard him say, I love my little girls more than anything. And I said to myself, oh, no, don't. You can't. Don't say that. Now, we're lacking context here. A lot of times when people said, I love my little girls more than anything, and he's saying that I want my girls to be alive, I don't want them to die in a nuclear war, we need to find some way to compromise with the Soviets and the communists, that sort of thing. And so Reagan's like, oh, don't say that. And Reagan said, but I had underestimated him. He went on, I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than to have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God. Now, here's the thing where you would reference this. If you want to do audience analysis, you think in terms of like, who's he talking to? He's talking to the American Association of Evangelicals, and he's reminding them, these communists that I'm trying to stand up to, they don't believe in God. They don't share our values, okay, or your values. And so Reagan was very much, very much catering to this evangelical audience by noting the atheistic, side of communism. And so with that, can I explain the Yalta Conference? Certainly, Jesse, I'd be glad to. The Yalta Conference was the conference that basically was responsible for the settlement of things in Europe after World War II, okay? The settlement of things in Europe after World War II. And first of all, they decide that they're going to divide Germany into zones of occupation, okay? So they're going to divide Germany into zones of occupation. And then when they divide Germany in zones of occupation, so the Soviets get their zone, and then Berlin's going to be divided as well. And then, of course, Stalin's like, hey, I need a sphere of influence over here. And it's like, okay. And then the other side of that is that the United Nations is going to be created. Now, here's something that we want to note, that when we think about comparing things and continuity, discontinuity, all of that kind of stuff that we want to get into, is why did the United States not join the League of Nations after World War I, but then they joined the United Nations after World War II? Well, when we think about what's going on with the League of Nations, that a faction, that one of the larger factions in Congress, actually, that the majority of people in the Senate, with the debate of the treaty, the majority of the people, of the senators, wanted to pass the treaty. It was a division between the people who were with Wilson, that we need to pass the treaty as is, and the reservationists who said that we need to pass the treaty with some reservations. We need to pass the treaty with a few things that make sure that the United States military cannot be called into action without the consent of Congress, so that only Congress can order the U.S. military into war. And so that was the concern. And so that, what ended up, those two sides couldn't compromise, and the United States didn't join the League of Nations. So the biggest problem that a lot of senators had at that time was, can the United States be drawn into a conflict without its consent? Okay, so can the United States be drawn into a conflict without consent? And so the UN is set up with the Security Council. All right, the UN Security Council is set up so that the five permanent members, okay, the five permanent members of the Security Council, that they are able to, these five permanent members are able to veto anything. And so the UN is set up to where the United States can never be forced to do anything. Okay. So when it comes down to it, when you think about the United States joining the UN, they address the concerns about why the United States didn't join the League of Nations. So the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China, they all had a seat on the Security Council, and each country had a veto on anything that the UN does. All right. And so the difference between the Northwest Ordinance and Land Ordinance. What are we talking about, Jacob? I'm not quite sure. That's something I wouldn't I wouldn't bark up that tree. I would note the Northwest Ordinance. That was, of course, the the ordinance passed during the Articles of Confederation that organized the so-called Northwest Territory, that territory northwest of the Ohio River and between the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers, which is today we call it the Midwest. And then that was, of course, setting up to have new states, to make new states, and it was set up so that slavery would not be legal in that area. That part would be closed to slavery, but I'm not sure what you're talking about, with a generic reference to a land ordinance. Okay. Now, Johann, first of all, let's note that we could see, that U.S. history didn't begin in 1492. 1491 is a symbolic date. And so we could be responsible, even though, now remember, only about 5% of the exam is estimated to come from the period before. Only about 5% of the exam is expected to come before 1607. Okay. So only about 5% there is going to come before that. So we want to note that we have to include as well, like the Spanish and the French and the New England and Southern colonies. So it's going to take up very little of the exam, but I do have a video on Native American cultures, and I also have some blog notes. Let's see, Native American cultures, APUSH. Okay. So I'm going to give you a link to that. Y'all like putting links in here and all of that. So this is something on my website that's got, got some things that's basically a transcription of that lecture. Okay, so those are a few things there. The era of good feelings, Karina. Okay, that is the period between the first and second two-party system, the period between the end of the War of 1812 and the election of 1824, in which John Quincy Adams was elected. Okay, so that's the era of good feelings. James Monroe's presidency between 1817, 1825. So basically, end of the War of 1812 to the 1824 presidential election. And this was a time where, remember, James Monroe was reelected almost unanimously. So this was a time in between the first and the second two-party system. All right. So with that, sinners in the hands of angry God, associate that with the first Great Awakening. All right. Different ways to get the complexity point. Now, the thing is that one thing to note, Carla, is that the complexity point is not going to, the complexity point, some people call it the unicorn point. Like it's one of those things. Now, I think that you can kind of get there by going into like similarities and differences on the LEQ, or causes and effects, or multiple causes. And then the biggest thing here, though, my standard for the complexity point. Okay, my standard for the complexity point was in order, like I'm thinking in terms of, could this have been written by someone? Could the person who wrote this teach a class on this? Like, not necessarily was that person a teacher, but is this like the student in the class that, like, I would say, like, look, the person who wrote this essay, I'll let you get up and teach my class for a little bit. Now, one thing we want to note, though, Jamie, is that we can't necessarily count on it just because you do similarities and differences. It's very clear that the complexity point is awarded at the reader's discretion, that it has to be an essay that is of great quality. So just because somebody addresses similarities and differences, if the essay is not of good quality, it's not going to get that complexity point. Okay, so that's what you want to note. That's what you want to know, note on that. Okay, so if you're that student, Rosemary, then you'll probably do fine. All right, and so when we talk about feminism in the three waves, now remember, first wave feminism, that starts in the antebellum period, and that is, during the antebellum period, you've got, what's called first wave feminism. That's, of course, the Seneca Falls Convention. A lot of these middle-class women had actually been a lot of these middle-class women had been involved in like abolition and temperance, the abolition movement and the temperance movement. And so they were, they saw that they were discriminated against, okay, that they're discriminated against. And this is something that, for example, they went to an abolition convention. Okay, so they went to an abolition convention in the UK. And then at this abolition convention, they were told that the women had to sit behind a screen. Like, not only could they not talk, but they couldn't even be seen. And so the Seneca Falls Convention was the first time where you've got a, basically a document that comes out of a group that says that women should be able to vote. Now, that was 1848. Now, which 1848 is a good memorization year because that's also the year of the end of the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so with that, we get into, that 1848 is a good year. Plus, if you've taken AP Euro, that's also significant in European history. And so from there, that doesn't happen until after World War I, the 19th Amendment. And I remember with the Progressive Amendment, 16, 17, 18, 19, income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition, and women's suffrage, ladies last, okay? Not ladies first with the progressive amendments, but ladies last, okay? So with that, that's first wave feminism. Now, women got the right to vote, but they didn't get with that access to professional employment, like the fields of medicine, law, and academia. They weren't getting, equal pay. They weren't, getting social equality, and they didn't really demand it until, after sometime after World War II. Okay, so we start to see with the publication of the Feminine Mystique. Okay, when we're thinking about the Feminine Mystique, that was published in 1963 by Betty Friedan, and this was really in the 1960s. Was when you started to see this feminist movement, which this second wave feminist movement. Now, I don't think you really need to get in a third wave feminism, but when you get into second wave feminism, what we're looking at there is this idea that women want to have equality in the workplace. They want to have equal pay. They want access to birth control. So when you think about like Lemon versus Kurtzman and Roe v. Wade, that once a woman has access to birth control, she can plan her family, and with that, she gets the ability to plan her career. Now, I don't know. Again, I don't think that you necessarily need to get into so-called like third wave feminism, as much as understanding that there is one wave of feminism that starts in the antebellum period and goes through World War I, and that's about political rights. And then second wave feminism, which is in the 1960s and 70s, and is looking for equal rights, equal rights in terms of employment, birth control, stuff like that. Now, also remember that the Equal Rights Amendment was not ratified in the 1970s, largely because of the intervention of Phyllis Schlafly, who was a conservative woman and the leader of the Eagle Forum. So conservative women struck back. They said, look, we don't want an equal rights amendment. They called this stop taking our privileges. Because when you think about it, ladies, I always get amused when, people are like, why would somebody not want the equal rights amendment? And I ask my class, I'm like, ladies, how many of y'all want to register for the draft? And most of the ladies in the class, they're like, I don't necessarily want to register for the draft. And so that's something that is a privilege that women have under the status quo. If the Equal Rights Amendment were passed, then women would have to register for the draft. You couldn't have that. Okay, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, as we go through that, let's see. So let's see if there's something here. Key things to know about the Enlightenment. Okay, so Allison, I've got a video on the American Enlightenment that you might want to take a look at. But remember that the Enlightenment was an 18th century philosophy that was based on, science, rationality, natural rights, and natural law. Now, Locke and Newton were kind of precursors for this. Now, also one distinction that I want to note when we're talking about the American Revolution, understand that there's a distinction between, on one hand, is the American Revolution being influenced by Enlightenment ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? You see that Jefferson's writing these things in the Declaration of Independence. Or is it more based on the violations, what the colonists see of their violations of their rights of traditional Englishmen? Okay, so the rights of traditional Englishmen going back to the Magna Carta. So is this, going back to the rights of traditional Englishmen, Reagan, or is this part of the Enlightenment? Locke is kind of both, because Locke is definitely, like, his theories were very influential in the Enlightenment, but Locke was also a writer, in the English political tradition. I wouldn't, technically there is such thing as third wave feminism. I would say that it's not necessary to know that for APUSH. Not necessary to know that for APUSH. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, I see here, I'm trying, can we yeet the wheat? Peter, yes, you can yeet the wheat. Okay, yeet the wheat, obtain that grain, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so what is Richard's question? Okay, so now Richard, yeah, I can't do that in like 2 minutes. Okay, I can't do that in 2 minutes. You're asking me to basically go through the better part of an entire century. So that's probably not going to happen, because this is actually coming to a close, ladies and gentlemen. So with that, briefly go over LEQs. Hannah, I would recommend a video by Joe's Production. It's also, if you want to take a look at the rubric, hopefully you've seen the rubric by now, but if you put APUSH LEQ rubric or APUSH DBQ rubric, you'll see those, okay? And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are, running out of time here. So with that, period 7 and 8, I would recommend, on YouTube, Joe's Productions, JOCZ. If y'all have never heard of Joe's Productions, he's got some really good Cram videos. Okay, so I would say to go take a look at his stuff there on YouTube. That Joe's Productions, I think, just has some really concise Cram videos that would work better for this, because I'm pretty much in a situation now where we have got our we've got our hour. And did somebody tell me hit the whoa? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we didn't quite get around to talking about the Treaty of Whoa. Okay, so as far as that goes, okay, we've got that. And, y'all want one more dab before we get out of here? All right, 1, 2, 3, dab. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all so much. One last dab, and best of luck to everybody. Go get that bread tomorrow and all of that. And remember that your exam tomorrow